It was too much work. The victim would be crucified lying down, then the cross propped up. His feet would wind up no higher above the ground than the chairs you're sitting in. Lions and hyenas were a real thing in first century Israel. The hyenas are still there. The records indicate that many a man and woman hung there, watched the animal come, and they were eaten alive from their feet up while they hung there like a slab of beef. Vultures sitting on their shoulders, pecking their eyes out while they lived. And no, I'm not trying to make anyone sick. I haven't told you all of it. I'm merely glossing over it. You see, this was life in the first century. We'd forgotten it. Pilate saw it every day in the week. He was not about to believe that a man with a chest capacity like that one would die in 6 hours on any cross. That's why he sent for the officer that was in charge of the execution detail, a centurion, the commander of 100 men. We'd call him a captain. It wasn't until that Roman officer could swear an oath to his own commander. Sure, he's dead. I put a spear in him myself just to make sure, or words to that effect, that Pilate would sign the chit that gave Joe permission to take the body off the cross. You can almost read the old man's sigh of relief. We're going to live a little longer. They took off running. In context, nothing else makes sense, because Luke uses a strange term in the Greek. It means that it was the time of the lighting of candles. The stars were beginning to come out. It was the eve of the high holiday, the Passover, the high Sabbath, the second most important day in the Jewish year. And the Jewish day starts at sundown, not sunrise. Based on that term, the time of the lighting of candles, those two old men had something less than an hour in which to live. You see, the penalty for working on any Sabbath was execution. The Jews put you in a rock pile and threw rocks at you until someone broke your head. They called it stoning, the Jewish method of doing it. This was the Roman method. Those two old men didn't have much chance of surviving if they got caught working on the high Sabbath. With Jesus' body, he was altogether too controversial then as well as today. Besides, they were already criminals under one law. Their own Sanhedrin had recently passed a law that said that anyone who admitted to being a follower or a disciple of the carpenter from Nazareth would be excommunicated. Now that gets virtually no one very excited today. But in first century Israel, it was a different story. Excommunication meant certainly you lost most of your temple privileges, but it went far beyond that. No one could knowingly by law walk within 6 feet of you on the street. You were denied the use of the bath. You were denied the use of the razor. You could not be taught in the presence of anyone else. Your testimony was worthless in any court of law. You couldn't hire nor could you be hired in Israel. You couldn't hold a job. You could neither buy nor sell beyond the absolute necessities of life, which the law interpreted to be bread and water. This means that whatever those two old men had been an hour earlier, suddenly they'd become awfully poor men. What good is your money, no matter how much you might have, if you can't purchase something with it? All they could buy was bread and water. Their property automatically reverted to the state. Their wives had no rights. They had sold it all down the tube to take a body off a cross. I don't know what they believed, but boy, they believed something. They disappear from history. There isn't even a believable legend about either one of them. There's a couple legends about Joe, but frankly, your imagination has to be better than mine to accept them. There doesn't seem to be anything on Nicodemus. It's almost as if they've been created to bury someone and disappear, like a few kings I read about, but that's getting philosophical. At that moment of time, they were sweating. All four writers, that makes it historical evidence, tell us something that gets extremely important, that the women watched everything that took place. One writer names 4 girls: Mary from the village of Magdala, Mary the Magdalene, the other Mary, probably the wife of Clopas, the mother of John Mark. Without question, this was Jesus' own aunt, his mother's older sister. It was common enough in the first century to give 2 girls in the same family the same name, Mary Beth, Mary Jane, that sort of thing. Many instances of it in literature. A woman named Salome, and his mother was there. John said also the other women who came up with him out of Galilee. So that means historically that there were at least 3 or 4 women, probably Moa, who watched everything that took place. As I said, that gets extremely serious. Now, I cannot prove this, but I refuse to believe that those 4 women sat on a rock and crocheted while 2 old men worked their heads off, simply because I haven't met any 4 women that would do that yet. Besides, if they were there, got caught there 1 moment after sundown, they too were Sabbath breakers, and the penalty was death. And they'd have been caught, no question. You see, the high priest and the Pharisees were watching everything that took place that night. How could they possibly have gone to Pilate the next morning, at least 12 hours in the future, and pointed out the exact tomb Jesus' body was in? How did they know where he was buried? if they hadn't been there the night before watching everything. Is it too much to stretch your imaginations just a little bit and visualize that little burial party throwing one eye over their shoulder at the sun to see how much longer they've got left to live, the other eye at that group in the distance waiting for their bones? They were sweating, and the girls must have helped. There was altogether too much work to be done. A cross had to be lowered, the nails pulled out of the body. There are some 30-odd steps involved in burying a man under Jewish law, both then and today. It begins by very formally addressing him by his Hebrew name and that of his father, Yeshua ben David, Jesus the son of David. We ask your forgiveness for any indignity we may inflict upon your body in the process of preparing you for burial. It ends by kissing his lips with love. Somehow they get that out of Genesis 50. The work is done by women. In between, he is to be washed, shaven, his hair cut, his beard trimmed, his fingernails clipped and cleaned. You couldn't just wash him. You had to dig a pit, use a special washing board. You couldn't use cool water, let alone cold. It had to be warm, fragrant, aromatic, spiced. Ultimately, he would be anointed in fragrant spices and oils in liquid form, clothed and wrapped in a sheet. A tremendous amount of work. By now, considerably less than an hour in which to do it. Again, the women must have helped. The cross was lowered, the nails pulled out of the body. They did at least as much as they had to do to preserve it. They wrapped him in a sheet. Using the Greek, Matthew and Luke say that Jesus was folded into the cloth. This one was stretched out flat. He was laid on his back on half of it. The other half was brought over his head and draped over the front. If that's not folded, somebody tell me what it is. Mark said he was wrapped. I don't see any conflict. John said he was bound. This cloth was tied around the ankles, again around the waist, by cords probably made of rushes. He wound up being wrapped, folded, and bound into the cloth, all at the same time. No conflict. They laid him in a particular tomb. Matthew said it was Joe's own tomb. As far as I'm concerned, that's immaterial. Personally, I think they might have used Pilate's tomb if it was any closer, and they thought they could have gotten away with it, because they were moving. Nicodemus' contribution, 100 pounds Roman weight, 70 pounds our weight of myrrh and aloes. Why? It doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. It's contradictory. You see, the Jews have never mummified a body, ever. The Jews have never embalmed a body if they could possibly help it. The Jews have never used winding strips. Sorry, kids, that's Christian tradition. The Bible does not say that Jesus was buried like a mummy. John was quite emphatic. Jesus was buried according to the manner and the custom of the Jews. And all the Jews have ever done, then or today, when the law permitted it, was to put a man in a sheet and bury him before sundown the same day. There was an Orthodox rabbi back in Connecticut that told me they would be doing it there if the law permitted it. They want the body to go back to dust as rapidly as possible. So why myrrh and aloes? That's why we had to read the Talmud. We had to get facts. About 2/3 of the way through that collection of holy law, we came across a rather obscure little tractate called the Emor of Athi, Jewish Burial Customs. This is almost verbatim. In ancient times, it was the custom to bury someone who had died of bowel trouble with spices and ointments placed next to the body. But because this was an embarrassment to the living, who were suffering from the same disease even while they lived, it became the custom, then afterwards it was enacted, it became law, to put spices and ointments next to the body of every dead person, so that there would never be any embarrassment to the living. All Nicodemus was doing was obeying his own law that called for spices and ointments to kill the smell of a decaying body. Several other references in the Talmud to the spices being used as a deodorant. If you wish to argue, think back to the story of Lazarus. He was a wealthy Jew. When he died, society people from Jerusalem came down to Bethany to help his sisters Mary and Martha mourn. Both accounts of the story clearly reveal that they loved their brother with a passion, and that they had the money and they had the desire to give their brother the best funeral that first century Israel could afford to give to anybody. If it really had been the custom to bury a man like a mummy, with 100 pounds of concrete or something in the folds, they'd have done it. But if they had, when Jesus stood outside that tomb and yelled, "Hey, lads, come on out," look it up. Nobody went in and got him. Nobody carried him out. It says that although he was bound hand and foot, he sat up, stood up, and he walked out.